And we're moving along with our Parallax series. This is part 3, and in this part, we're going to convert the code that we wrote in the first part, the super hacky Parallax website thing, into code that uses the library that we wrote in the previous part. So, I've created a new examples directory within the project for the library that we created, and then a new directory within that examples called fix modules then scroll, which is the example that we're going to build. And inside, I copied in the HTML from part 1 and the CSS from part 1, and then I've just set up a basic Webpack config. So I'll just quickly show you what I have. So the CSS is exactly what we saw in part 1. There's nothing to see there. Same with the HTML. And the Webpack config is a super basic config that just has an index.js and spits out a bundle.js. And of course, in our package.json, we've got Webpack, Webpack CLI, Webpack dev server, and then we've just got some scripts. Build runs Webpack, start runs Webpack dev server. Okay, so that's all we really need. So I'm just going to exit out of here and open up Tmux just so that I can have a server running, and I'll just run yarn start, and that just runs the dev server running on port 8081, and then we'll open up Vim. So the first port of call is to import our Parallax provider module, but because we're in the same folder structure as that, I can just import Parallax provider from, and we need to go up 3 levels and then into source. So now we have hold of that Parallax provider class, and then we can use it as we need. So the first thing we'll do is create a new instance of this Parallax provider. So we'll just export that as default, just so that we don't have to make it a variable because we're not going to use it. So there's Parallax provider, and of course that takes an array. And we'll create mount point. So this will be mounted at 0. So this is the first section where we have the mount and zoomy thing. So the mount point is there, duration 500 pixels. And the controller will be a function that we will call phase 1. And then we'll create the section for the transition. Mount point for that, again, is 0, because we created mount points that were relative to the end of the previous section. And we'll give this a duration of 300 pixels and a controller, and we'll call that phase 1 transition. And then we'll create a new one, mount point 0, duration 1000. So this is the text splitting part, and a controller phase 2. So in the first part, the hacky version, our text splitting and the scaling of the mascot were in one section. But we can create those as 2 separate sections because they don't necessarily need to be linked in any way. So we'll make this phase 2 the moving and the animating of the words, and then we'll create another section with a mount point of -500. Because we want it to start 500 pixels before the end of this last section. And the duration of that will be 500 pixels, so they'll end at the same time. And the controller we'll give it, we'll just call it turtle expand. So bear in mind, none of these controllers, phase 1, phase 2, phase 1 transition, we haven't created those yet, but we will. And then we'll create another section. So this will be the final section. So we'll mount this 100 pixels after the end, just so that we have a small amount of time where nothing's happening. And again, duration, make this 2000 pixels, controller, and we'll call this calc scroll. So there we go. We have the definition of what we want to happen. So we have the different sections and the controllers. So now we just need to create these controllers and have all of the interactions within them. So the first thing I'll do is just grab hold of all of the queries that we used to get the DOM elements from part 1. So they looked something like this. So we're grabbing hold of first page and the backgrounds and the titles and all that sort of stuff. So I'm not going to explain all of this. If you don't understand it, go back to the first part of this. I'll link to it up there. Now that we have all of this, we want to create the functions that control each of the sections. So we'll start with phase 1. And we'll pass in the offset and duration. And then we'll have the conditional statements to check if we're before, during, or after this section. Of course, this is phase 1, which is being mounted right at the top of the page. So there's no time in which we'll be above it, so we don't need that check. So we'll just say if offset is less than duration, then we are inside the section. Else, this must mean we are after the section. So we want to do the mount and zoom thing. So we'll calculate the percentage that we are through the animation. So that is this time not like the first time. This is very simple. This is just offset divided by duration. And then we can use that percentage to scale the different elements. And that scaling is exactly like it was in the first part. So I'll just copy in from the first part what we had. So we're just using that percentage, multiplying it by a different constant for each element, and then scaling it by that. So there we go. I explained how this logic actually works in the first part. So again, go back if you don't understand. And now we need to have the after the section reset code, which again is exactly the same as it was in the first part. So I'll just copy it in, uncomment that. And here we're just hard resetting all of these to the values that they would be after the animations. When this percentage is 100%, or this is 1, then this will be 1.4, 1.1, 1.04, etc. That's what we're resetting it to after that. So that is the phase 1 controller done. And this is much cleaner, much tidier than it was in the first part, where it was super hacky. So I hope you're starting to understand the advantages of using this library and these abstractions and cleaning things up. It's just wonderful stuff. So now we'll write the phase 1 transition code, offset duration. This time we are going to need to check if we're before this section, during it, and after. So we'll have if offset is less than 0, we are before. Else if offset is less than duration, during. Else after. So then the before code we're going to want to have in is just setting the opacity of the first page to 1. So we'll just say first page.style.opacity equals 1. That's it. That's all we need to do to reset this transition. And then afterwards, we're also going to want to reset it to 0. And then the during, just as above, we'll calculate the percentage, just offset divided by duration. And now we want to animate the opacity based on that percentage, just like we did before in the first part. So that's opacity equals 1 minus percentage. That is the transition controller done. So now we can create phase 2 controller. Again, offset duration. And being repetitive, we're just going to say offset is less than 0. Then this is before. Else if offset is less than duration, during. Else after. So this code for phase 2 is going to be slightly different, because if you remember, we had that trigger point. So as soon as we started scrolling into phase 2, we had Hungry Turtle code text. The hungry started moving upwards, the code started moving downwards, and the turtle stayed still for a short period of time, and then eventually we hit a trigger point, and then that turtle started moving off to the left. So that makes this controller need a little bit more work, but not too much. So just up at the top, I'll define a constant, and I'll call it middle trigger, and I'll set that equal to 250. I can't even remember what I set it to in the first part, if I'm honest, but 250 will do for now. So when we are before this section, we want to make sure that all of the text is transformed 0. So I'll just paste in the code that I had from part 1, where we just reset all of the translations to 0. And then afterwards, I'm just gonna set the display of each part to none, like we did, so that we're not interfering with any of the other sections when we're afterwards. And that also means that during, we're gonna have to reset the display to inline block. So I will copy that code in. So we've reset it to inline block so that we can actually see it after we've reset it to none. And then we want to animate the hungry and the code based on the offset that we're into this section. So I'll just paste that in from before. So we're just taking the transform, we're translating phase 2 title parts 0, which is the word hungry, by negative offset, so that's translating it upwards. We're taking the second element and translating that by positive offset, which moves it down. And then the first is just the word turtle, which doesn't move, so we're just keeping that at 0. And then to check if we're after the trigger point that we defined up here, we can say if offset is larger than middle trigger, and this is where we want to start moving the word turtle. So I'll paste in the code to do that. So we're just grabbing hold of the first part, which, as you remember, is the word turtle, translating 3D by negative offset minus middle trigger. So this offset minus middle trigger is just normalizing the offset to be the offset for just the turtle word, so that when the turtle word starts moving, the offset is 0. And there we go. So that is that. We have phase 2 controller done. So now moving on to the turtle expand controller. Function turtle expand offset duration. So this should all be becoming monotonous for you now, because you kind of just understand the point. So I'm just going to speed through. So at this point, we're going to animate the turtle. And I think, just to spice things up a bit, I'm going to add a little tweening. I'll say scale amount equals ease out back. So this is a function that we're going to create soon. And we'll give it offset 0, 1.1 duration. And just down here, I will paste in the function that does the tweening. So I'm not going to explain this because, if I'm honest, I haven't really dug into how it works myself. But just trust me, this creates a nice tweening, like easing. The turtle is going to scale up, it's going to go slightly beyond the scale that we want, and then settle back down nicely. And it just gives a much more professional look than just a straight linear scale up that looks kind of robotic. So back into this turtle expand, we've got the scale amount from this easing function, and we're taking it from offset, so that's the offset that we're into the scaling, so that's like the time that we are into the scaling. And we're starting from a scale of 0, we're ending at a scale of 1.1, and it's going to take us duration amount of time. So now that we've got that scale amount, we can say logo image.style.transform equals scale amount. And that will scale up our turtle logo by the amount that our easing function is telling us. And with that, we have the turtle expand controller finished. And now moving on to the last controller, which is the calculation of the scrolling. So we'll drop down here again, function calc scroll offset duration. And that's the calculation scroll controller finished. So with everything complete, if you remember, we had a Webpack dev server running. So if we hop into the browser to localhost 8081, where that dev server is running, we should see our app. So there we go. We've got our HTML and CSS. That's a good start. So hopefully, if we scroll, we'll start to see everything moving as we expect. As we scroll, there we go. We're getting the zoom and the transition and the moving off and the scaling of the turtle. So you can see the easing happening there. So as I zoom up it's getting larger and larger. And then you can see just there, it's slightly larger and it just settles down. So there it is, large, settles down. So as that comes through, it just looks that slightly bit more professional having that. And then we've got this. We can see here this progress bar doesn't reach all the way to the bottom. So that'll be just the duration of this final section that I set is just not quite right. So it's not making it all the way to the bottom. But that isn't a big issue. But now, the great thing about having this abstraction that we've built is we can start manipulating the length of every section without having to really tinker with our code. So we've defined the controllers, which just deals with an offset and a duration, and we're just dealing with those generalized values. But if we come into our code here, just maximize this out, we've got the configuration all here. So let's say, for example, this section is a duration of 500 pixels, but we want to have that as a duration of 1000 pixels. So we can save that. But now, if we come back into the browser and we start scrolling, we see that this zoom happens much slower than it did before, and then we go into the transition. And all we had to change was the length of this section, and everything else adjusted because everything is happening relative. And that's the beauty of this abstraction. So we could really make this ridiculous and set this up to 5,000. I've set the CSS for the whole HTML page isn't long enough for this to happen, but just to illustrate how everything will work, we can just refresh here to make sure we've got the fresh version. And we scroll and we can see we're halfway down the page and we're not even close to finishing this animation. And as we keep scrolling, so we've gotten to the bottom of the page and we haven't hit the transition yet. And we can do that, and all the other code will just adjust. A potentially great improvement to this library would be to add some functionality that will calculate the height that the page needs to be for us to see all of the animation. So right now it's set manually with CSS, and it's not set enough for us to see the whole animation when this is so long here. But if we calculated that dynamically with JavaScript and then set the height, we would be able to see all of the animation. So that would be really cool. But I hope you can see the power here that now that we've got everything defined, we can start playing around with the timings and things will just work. They'll just settle into place because everything is working in tandem with each other. Where before, in our hacky version, if we wanted to make one section slightly longer, we'd have to change multiple values. And things would just kind of get all weird and they wouldn't work and it just wouldn't be good. But with this, we have the power to tinker with things very, very easily. So in the next part, we're going to test our library using Jest to make sure that everything is working as we expect it. That's just best practice. And then in the part after that, we will finally be deploying this library to NPM. So if you like this video, give me a big thumbs up, subscribe, notification bell. If you really like what I'm doing, check out my Patreon and join my community for exclusive behind the scenes stuff and live streams and all sorts of fancy things like that. But until next time, stay hungry and keep coding.